Cynthia Kros is a heritage specialist and historian who was an associate professor in the Department of History at Wits History Workshop, and subsequently the head of the Division of Arts, Culture and Heritage Management in the Wits School of Arts. She has published extensively in the fields of heritage, history education. She currently is an honorary research associate of the History Workshop. And Katie Mooney is a historian, curator, and heritage practitioner. She was a researcher at the Wits History Workshop for 6 years before working as a senior researcher at Robben Island Museum for 3 years, followed by 3 years as a curator at Iziko Museum. Currently, she runs her own research consultancy and is an associate member of the History Workshop. So now I'll hand over to our speakers, Cynthia Kros, Katie Mooney. You can proceed with your presentation.
Thank you very much. It's really great to be in the History Workshop space. We're going to read our paper for timekeeping purposes. So I just want to share my screen. Is that fine? Can you see the slides?
Yes, that's fine.
Yes. Okay. So in this paper, we start by reflecting on some of our experiences working as consultant historians over the last 5 years for a variety of clients, and then proceed to a case study as a way of probing the ways in which working as consultant historians has led us to engage with the archive and to reflect on it in particular ways. And just to say that both of us have affiliations with institutions, but we're not currently employed by any of them. So we are very much freelance researchers. Our client base has been diverse, ranging from government entities and corporate agencies to heritage organizations and museums. We adopt a proper noun in the use of the term client to suggest a dynamic and reciprocal relationship with an individual. Client is a person or entity whose own interests and desires it is essential to keep clearly in view, while at the same time recognizing their openness to new ideas, including occasionally being prepared to accept suggestions for a rebranding of their product, and in some cases, a reworking of the commissioning brief. Our relationship with clients has been varied, and whilst the terms of engagement are sometimes negotiable, there are some constraints. A client does have an agenda, is usually answerable to an executive board of some sort, and has to appeal to a general constituency, and equally important, has to take every possible step to avoid alienating people who can make their voices heard. In the worst case scenario, ending with client being associated with a damaging hashtag on social media with real world repercussions. There are costs and benefits of working as a consultant historian. We start with costs. The subject of research is almost always decided on by client. And in the first briefing session, client will generally have quite firm ideas about why this is an appropriate subject and even how it should be handled. Generally, our commissions have concerned individuals considered to have made a mark on history, or conversely, to have failed to make a mark when, by all rights, they should have. Client may want to resuscitate the reputation of a now obscure person from the past, or to swing the tower viewer to focus more or less exclusively on a particular part of the historical terrain, not usually foregrounded, say Cape Town during the anti-apartheid struggle. These demands may lead to an exhilarating exercise, but generally, client is understandably hesitant to endorse any blemishes on the landscape that might be revealed. In the case of individuals, a general tendency to hagiography is exacerbated by the worry of offending surviving family members or meeting with disapproval on social media. Another cost, without doubt, is deadline pressure. Clients usually cannot exceed their budget, and it is foolish for consultant historians to work for more hours than they have costed in the proposal to do the job, because they will not be remunerated accordingly. Although we have committed this folly many times over. Of course, drawing up a budget which calculates the number of person-hours required for a particular research task is in itself quite a difficult exercise, but perhaps no different from what is required for a grant application in the academy. Consultant historians have quite often relived their student experience of working through the night, knowing that the next morning would bring emails firmly reminding them of the fast approaching, usually inflexible deadline for submission. In some cases, the situation is rendered even more stressful by tight word limits. Space allocated to text is often very restricted, even for digital formats. The final product is able to reflect only a small portion of what we have delivered in terms of content. Perhaps that takes us to the most anxiety-inducing cost, namely that we do not have control over the final product. Finally, on the cost side, it has to be noted that exhibitions and websites are almost always ephemeral. In effect, after they have been shown or hosted for a prescribed period, they are mostly doomed to an existence as the kind of ghosts we will discuss later. Before we present what we calculate would fall on the benefits side of the balance sheet, it is necessary to dwell for a moment on the reasons an organization makes the decision to turn to professional historians. Why would they not merely look up the information they believe they require on the internet? There is a multitude of answers, as it turns out, some to do with the complexity of information that might be presented on the websites their searchers deliver. At some stage, in our experience, clients would realize that it is also important to have a way of testing the validity of the sources they have encountered in a Google search. Client thinks that historians carry around the knowledge of innumerable people, events, and eras in their heads, and that historians are in possession of a secret key or decryption code to the archive. Often, client imagines that everything historical is kept in one big building that is inaccessible to the public. Interestingly, client is often very insistent on having the support of the archive. For reasons specified above concerning potential reputational damage, they want the legally impervious facts which they suppose reside there. Invariably, one has to prepare client for disappointment and the idea that the archive will almost certainly turn out to be
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I think I got cut off briefly. Am I back on?
Yes, you're back on. We can hear you.
Okay, sorry, but I'm not sure what happened there. Our recent work as consultant historians has caused us, perhaps with more intensity than before, to reflect on what the responses might be to E.H. Carr's enduring question, what is history? And its corollary, what is the historian? It turns out these are baffling questions in many ways. but it is stimulating to continue to pursue them and, in the process, to interrogate our relationship with the archive, which is, as noted, privileged, but also one requiring both focused application and a paradoxical willingness to take risks and embark on unexpected journeys. This, it turns out, is the supreme benefit. There is a vast literature on archive. I'm trying to change my slide. Oh, there we go.
Katie, your slides have disappeared.
Oh.
Yeah.
Are they back?
No.
No. Sorry about this. Can you see them now?
Yes.
Okay. There is a vast literature on the archive, some of which informs our work, but for our central metaphor, we have turned to Ghost of Archive by Vern Harris and his idea of ghosting. What we have realized in the course of our research is that many of our subjects have been ghosted, in some cases, at least until very recently, meaning that while at one time they were well known and admired, the archive has since abruptly terminated its relationship with them. One of the most striking examples of ghosting is that of the Sauger family. And I'm going to hand over to Cynthia to speak to that. Thanks.
Thanks, Katie. I'm also really pleased to be back in the history workshop space. So as Katie was explaining, our work as consultant historians actually led us on some unexpected journeys and encounters and led us to think about the archive in a different sort of way. So this is a kind of case study. So the Sauger family has been ghosted, and we particularly in this seminar are going to focus on Jotello Festiri, who was the youngest of Theo and Janet Sauger's, Burnside's 4 surviving sons. He was born in 1865 on his parents' mission station, Mogwali, in the Eastern Cape. He died in the Ummerlinder district of East London at the age of 41 in 1906. He qualified in 1886 at the Royal School of Veterinary Medicine in Edinburgh, which was nicknamed Dick after its founder. And in 1889, he was appointed a second assistant government veterinarian to the Cape Colonial veterinary surgeon. As Beinart and Debo note in their scientific imagination in South Africa, it was very rare for a person of color to be appointed to the senior civil service. And here you can also see Sauger with his wife, his Scottish wife, Catherine Watson Chalmers. Okay, so now, yes, okay. There's substantial evidence that Sauger was very respected in his own time, including by, quote, European farmers and fellow scientists, such as the renowned botanist Peter McEwen and the Cape Colonial government. The Agricultural Journal, which was the official publication of the Agricultural Department of the government, published several articles by Sauger, and after his early death, carried a eulogy which had been reprinted from Izwi Labantu, which was edited by his brother and others. Sauger made several significant contributions in the field of veterinary science, but we argue that the entanglement of his story with scholarly attempts to appraise the role of the rinderpest epizootic of 1896 at a tipping point in the history of what came to be South Africa, both served to raise his profile during his lifetime and to lead to his later ghosting. We would like to emphasize that this paper is about his ghosting in the historiography, this part of the paper. It's not a biography, and it does not attempt to locate him in the evolving racial classifications of his time. Okay, next slide, Katie. Duncan Hutchin, okay, so he was Sauger's boss. He was the colonial veterinary surgeon to the government of the Cape Colony, the second person to have been appointed to that post in 1880. He had also schooled at Dick. And this is an extract on the slide from his retrospective reflection on the impact of rinderpest as it swept southwards from Bulawayo and entered territory administered by the Cape Colony in 1896. And we'll just look at the last few lines of what he wrote, with the veldt being strewn with putrefying carcasses of dead oxen and many parts littered with the contents of stranded wagons. The impact of rinderpest was devastating. Now, Hutchin and his team adopted the tried and tested method of stamping out to deal with the rinderpest epizootic, as well as erecting fences and setting up patrols to restrict movement, establishing quarantine zones and disinfecting people traveling from infected areas. If you look on the right of the slide, you'll see a photograph that's often used to illustrate the rinderpest epizootic, but it was actually the result of stamping out. In other words, killing all infected cattle, all cattle likely to have been infected in an area, and then usually burying them. All of these measures naturally proved controversial and led to considerable opposition in certain quarters. Soga and Hutchin had both learned that stamping out was the only viable method of containing rinderpest. And Soga was to continue to argue for the efficacy of stamping out until the end of 1896, at least, drawing on evidence from his own experiences. Now, for us, it's sometimes difficult to imaginatively relocate ourselves in the scientific world of the late 19th century. So for all the rapid technological progress and the development of bacteriology that had taken place in the previous few decades, germ theory was still relatively undeveloped. The virus that caused rinderpest was identified only in 1902. And in the closing years of the 19th century, it had not been seen with certainty, to quote Cape Medical Officer of Health George Turner and German bacteriologist Willem Kohler. Okay, archival evidence, next slide, Katie. Yeah, gives us a clear picture both of Soga as a trusted veterinarian being summoned to deal with emergencies, all these telegrams that fly between him and the Secretary of Agriculture, even before the rinderpest epizootic arrived, and it also tells us how hard-pressed he was. It's not surprising that he was forced to take early retirement because of poor health and apparently suffered severe back pain. Okay, now we come to a map. We'll just try to keep this in your head while we're telling the rest of the story. So particularly notice in British Bechuanaland, the places with dots are where Sauger was working, stamping out in 1896, and then just look at Kimberley. That's going to feature later in the story, and then a party of people are going to travel from Kimberley to the town reserve there in British Bechuanaland. So just try and keep that in mind as we go through the rest. Okay, so now we kept on coming across Sauger's voice in the Agricultural Journal. And we wondered why, given that he appeared quite often in the 1890s, why he was so scarce in the secondary literature, not completely absent, but scarce, and why his voice, which was eloquent and powerful, was almost nowhere to be heard. We know that on at least one occasion he was actually invited to publish in the Agricultural Journal, presumably because his opinions were trusted and his voice was considered to be persuasive. Now, you have to read the paper for this next thing, the story of a footnote, because it's much too complicated to talk about in the time we have here. But what we do is we trace the story of a footnote made to a dire warning about rinderpest issued by a Cape veterinarian, mysterious Cape veterinarian, in 1892 that appears in Charles van Onselen's very influential article on the impact of the rinderpest epizootic published in 1972. Its most direct antecedent is the Oxford History of South Africa, which had been published the year before. We believe that this warning was an extended one issued by JF Soga that appeared in the Agricultural Journal, and it's quite Shakespearean in its evocation of the devastation that rinderpest would bring were it to succeed in entering the colony. In giving an idea of its vitality, let it be understood that lung sickness and red water are simply fools to it. So we kept on wondering why Sauger's name wasn't mentioned, either in the Oxford History, which was famous for including the history of independent African kingdoms in Southern Africa and incurred the censorial wrath of the apartheid government, or by Van Onselen. Van Onselen does mention him by name in another footnote, but not in connection with the warning. And he doesn't quote from Sauger's extremely evocative prose. In the paper, we discuss lots of other works in the secondary literature. You can see some images of them on the screen. And so Beinart, Dubois, Guilfoyle, Poulet Pufulo, and so on. And some of them do deal with Sauger, but not in a way that he's quite marginal to the story still. So we kept on asking, why did these authors forego the opportunity, as we thought, of bringing in Sauger's voice, and thus the voice of a rare scientist of color in the 19th century? And why not draw on Sauger's dry humor? In recounting opposition he and Hutchin encountered, he said the natives absolutely refused to have their cattle shot and would in no way render assistance. Instead, they threatened to shoot Dr. Hutchin and myself. So it's unlikely that any of the authors we discuss intended to efface Sauger's name or downplay his role. He was effectively ghosted because they were addressing particular questions that led them away from him. Van Onselen, for instance, was trying to address a number of stereotypes that existed about Africans in the 1970s. Okay, now just a few words about the redeeming of the Sauger archive. Redeeming is a play on the concept of deeming, which means granting archival significance to, which is developed by Carolyn Hamilton. And the slide shows a number of researchers who've been involved in research around what we've called redeeming the Sauger archive. Curator Janet Carolyn, historian Natasha Erlang, researcher Mike Kenyon, and documentary filmmaker J.C. Lewis. Note especially the Sauger Studies Conference, which was hosted by GIAS at UJ and convened by Sauger scholar Joanne Davis and multidisciplinary artist Sikumbuzo Makandula earlier this year. J.C. Lewis, you can see him at the top left of your screen, was the person who first brought JF Soga to public attention, and he's currently making a documentary of Sauger's life, which is expected to be released at the end of this year. Now, we are interested to see how Lewis and others deal with the stamping out episodes. We learned from Sauger's own descriptions in great detail what a horrific business it was. Sauger and his fellow veterinarians and assistants had to shoot hundreds of cattle at close range. And how will this be represented to contemporary audiences? Okay, so on the left of your screen, you see Robert Koch, who was a famous German bacteriologist. And the Cape Colonial government invited him to come to the colony to produce an inoculation against rinderpest. And he arrived at the end of 1896. And he was set up in a very well-equipped laboratory on a compound that was owned by De Beers. And in early December, he traveled with a party of scientists to Towns, remember the map, to visit Alexander Eddington's railway car laboratory. You see Eddington's institute, the Cape Bacteriological Institute, in the middle of the slide. I mean, he had to leave that comfortable institute and work in a railway car on a siding in a native reserve, quote, which he wasn't very happy about. Anyway, they went to visit him. And from there, they went to the town of Towns to see JF Soga, who was working there. And Koch reported, I was told I would find a large number of diseased cattle. However, I did not see one beast in the town, as all the cattle were driven by the inhabitants in the mountains. Government veterinary surgeon Sauger informed me that the people living in Towns had lost already 20,000 head of cattle from the pest and thought to save the remainder by driving them far away. The party returned to Kimberley via Eddington's lab soon afterwards. Okay, and so to conclude, there's the death notice that was drawn up after an inquest when Jotello Soga died in 1906. And we don't really know a lot yet about what happened to JF Soga after this incident. In 1906, he died of a laudanum overdose. Laudanum was commonly taken for pain, and you know that he had severe back pain. It was ruled accidental in the inquest. We have no idea what really had transpired between Soga and Koch's party, the story that I've just told you. But we have a vivid image of them turning their backs on him, just as surely as we think history was to do. Thank you.
Thank you for that interesting overview of your paper. I really appreciate it. So we'll move on to the next section of our seminar, where we allow the audience to engage, to join in the conversation. If you have any questions or comments, you can either raise your hand or leave questions or comments in the chat box. So I'll just wait for any questions or comments from the audience.
May I just say, Nathan, that you've seen on the slide that Katie showed a variety of our clients, but we aren't able to disclose this particular one that we're talking about in relation to the Saugers until they have launched their campaign.
Noted. So while the audience, oh, I see a hand. Edwin Smith, you can go ahead.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So I will just have audio on. Just a few comments on the paper that was shared with us earlier. That I observed two things just for the authors. The Onderstepoort Veterinary Institute is very often confused with the University of Pretoria's Faculty of Veterinary Sciences at Onderstepoort, which is just across the street. When on page 6 you refer to the Onderstepoort Veterinary Institute, it's renaming its library in honor of Jotello. I think you actually mean the University of Pretoria's Faculty of Veterinary Sciences Library, which is what was named after Soga, and not the Veterinary Institute's library. If you can just double check that. I'm absolutely certain that it was the University of Pretoria's Faculty of Veterinary Sciences Library that was renamed in honor of Jotello. That's on page 6. Just to point that out. Then the second point I'd like to raise is there is a reference on page 9 to the Dean of the University of Pretoria Veterinary Science faculty, we call him Gerald Swan. The reference begins with apparently. The Dean said that the university intended to honor Sauger in 2009 already. Now, I found that particular reference, and that's not a reference that is footnoted, so it reads like an opinion or conclusion drawn by the authors. I found it very interesting because, for instance, Jerry Swan, the Dean of the faculty, is, it so happens, from Amalinda district in East London, and might actually have become a veterinarian precisely because of the connection between the first South African born veterinarian being from his district. But you will not come across that nuance in that detail, because I think what is being communicated there is that an institution like the University of Pretoria, with everything else that is associated with in the higher education landscape, amongst other things, a historically white Afrikaans university, would not out of its own volition necessarily honor Black scientists in this way. But Jerry Swan was very instrumental in the process of the university actually honoring. And it'll be interesting to look a little bit deeper into Jerry's involvement and his role and his motivation for the university to come to the point where they did actually honor Jotello and not dismiss it as within the context of how one normally treats how the University of Pretoria engages with these issues. I think it's an interesting link between Jerry Swan and him becoming a veterinarian, being from Amalinda in East London, where Jotello himself comes from, and whether there were any prior knowledge on his part of the stature and influence and significance of a Jotello located within the space that it comes from. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that. Can we have Mike Canyon, and then Cynthia and Mooney, you can respond to that. Mike Canyon, you can go ahead.
Thank you, Nathan. Edwin forgot to mention that he's from East London, and I'm talking to you from East London, so we're in charge here. Okay, on a serious note, thank you very much. Fascinating stuff. I do speculate that there is possibly another layer to the Jotello story, though, and Cynthia, this is something that we've talked about. Daniel Guilfoyle, not in his PhD, but off the record, suggests that a great number of the early Cape veterinarians hit the bottle and developed alcohol problems. And I think the subtext to that is the stress of the work, the hours, the travel, the stress, the tension, the competition, the conflict, the threats, death threats, etc. I mean, if you just look at Jotello's movements, they are vast in a period before motorized transport, backwards and forwards. He was trying to keep a family together at the same time, and there's my speculation is that he cracked under the pressure like anyone would have, and possibly quite some time before he actually left the public service, whether he was forced to, obliged to, or honored to. In 1899, I'm not clear. But at least 2 years earlier, there is a record of what appears to be a breakdown by William Charles Scully, and Scully himself, deeply involved in combating rinderpest in the Ngamakwe district, who called Soga in. Scully himself says he had to take 7 months unpaid leave to recuperate from that period. So I wonder if there wasn't a cloud of disapproval, okay, at breakdowns, at possibly resorting to alcohol, possibly the back pain. There was more to it than back pain. But really, this is speculation, and it's not to minimize Jotello's work. It's just to say that this guy was a human being, and under pressure, which would have broken most people. Came from a remarkable family of achievers, and it's not surprising that one of those achievers actually hit breaking point at some point. So I just wanted to put that out there, and I hope we can piece some of this together in more detail as time goes by, out of empathy for the guy and for his achievements. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for that. Cynthia and Katie, would you like to respond to those comments, and then we'll take another round of questions or comments.
Thanks. I would like to respond to Edwin and Mike. Is that okay? Okay, so Edwin, thanks for giving our paper such a close reading. That's really helpful, and for pointing out the inaccuracies. And I was concerned that you read it as critical of Onderspoort or the University of Pretoria and must sort out that affiliation properly. But when I wrote apparently, because I take responsibility for that, I must change my word, but I didn't mean to cast doubt on what Gerard Swan was saying. It's just that the way that it's reported in what I read was he was being quoted. In other words, I didn't want to say that that's certainly what he said because someone else was quoting him, but I obviously have to express it in a more precise way. And the idea of speaking to him and exploring that connection with Amalinda and Jotello is absolutely fantastic. I'm sure we'll take that up. And then Mike, well, if you read the paper, I hope you'll see more of a reference to you and your work, which was very inspiring. And And I did notice that you drew on Guilfoyle, which is quite interesting because Guilfoyle does mention Sauger, but again, you know, doesn't really bring in his voice. But I think it was you who used him very productively to extend our understanding of the stresses of the work, which I just suggested by talking about how stamping out required for killing of cattle at close range, hundreds, maybe thousands of cattle, and just to imagine even that. Never mind about 48 hours in the saddle and that kind of thing. Yeah, and what you said at the end about, you know, the guy was a human being. I think that's what Katie and I are often wrestling with, and which she alluded to in the beginning of her presentation, is that sometimes your client doesn't want you to admit that people are just human beings with all kinds of flaws. They get worried. So if you say this person hit the bottle, you know, they'll say, please, can you take that line out? So that's one of our dilemmas in working in this kind of field. Thank you.
Thank you for that. So there's one comment in the chat box. I'll read that, but Noah, you can go ahead before I read the comment.
Great, thanks, Nathan, and thanks, Cynthia and Katie. I want to throw back a question at the two of you that you raised in your paper and in your presentation, and that is, what is an historian? So I wonder if you could say something about, I mean, you're both accomplished historians, and you're asking us to reflect on the work that you've done with various clients. And so I suppose my pointed question is, what has it done for your own definition of who you are as historians? I mean, you work for various clients, and I know that you cannot reveal your clients, but just from the PowerPoint presentation, there's the range, the public sector, they are private clients, and presumably they have different expectations and different views about history and different views about the work of the historian. You know, I mean, many of us, you know, and the history workshop, you know, has worked for many organizations, principally, you know, community organizations, has worked with the local government, provincial government, trade unions, civic organizations. And your use of the word client for me is very interesting because it does suggest a particular kind of relationship. Now, of course, no doubt there's some payment involved, but is that the essential relationship? I mean, does client and the client relationship define what you do and therefore the work of yourselves as the historian in these projects? And then I suppose the final question is, what happens to your research? I mean, do you hand over the research to the clients? What happens to the archive that you produce? Because you're producing both history and you're producing archives. What happens to that sort of that part of your intellectual work in this relationship? Thanks.
Thanks, Noah. So I'll just read the two comments in the chat box. Just have a look. So the first comment is, would you say that he has faced archival erasure because he worked in an elite field like veterinary science and was known to a lot of ordinary people? Would you say his story helped to decolonize the scientific field in the 1800s? Also, would you say being a freelance historian allows you to do projects that you feel are meaningful, Dr. Mooney, like this one? So that's the first comment, several questions in there. And just another question in the chat box. I'm curious about the early stages of a project like this. How did you reach the decision to make this paper about Sauger's archival erasure, as opposed to making it a biographical project? Was this decision your prerogative as historians, or did his family or client want it done that way? Cynthia and Katie, maybe you can respond to those questions, and yeah. And then we'll have another round of questions.
Okay, thanks, Nathan. Katie, do you want to start this time around?
Sure. Yeah, thanks for Thanks for those questions and points. I think I'll speak to the relationship with client part. Sure. So it kind of depends on client and the different types of relationships that we've built with them. So in most cases, you would develop quite a hefty content document, and you would submit that and hand it over to client for their archive. In some cases, they do have, so for the City of Cape Town, which I can disclose, the Arts and Culture branch has an archive in the making, and so they would keep things like the recorded interviews, sort of drafts of documents that we've produced. But at this stage where they are, that material isn't accessible to the public because it's kind of a new thing that they're developing. So the work for the Arts and Culture branch in particular doesn't always get out into the public domain, which is quite frustrating because sometimes it sits on shelves, you know, for decades, and so that material is lost. In the larger project of which Jotello Soga features, it's quite difficult to speak about at the moment because the project, the launch is due in about 2 weeks, and we have signed a non-disclosure agreement, which is quite common in relationships with clients. And part of the reason for that is so that the ideas aren't out there and they aren't shared. So when you do a project for Ezeco Museums, for example, you also have to sign a non-disclosure until the project launch. The client usually retains everything that you have produced. For this paper, it wasn't client's idea to not do a biography. We have chosen to focus more on how the project has prompted us to engage with the archive. So this paper is independent of client. I'm not sure if that helps answer the last question about the project. Cynthia, I'm not sure if you want to jump in. I'm afraid I've got a bit lost.
So client, I mean, this would also take account of one of Noah's questions about, do we have a relationship with client? And yes, we do tend to develop rather close relationships with client because we're working very intensively with them. And you're usually working with highly intelligent, very well-educated people. So they give you as good as you can, you know, it leads to conditions for very nice, interesting dialogues. And in our paper, we quote a survey that was done of advertising agencies, actually, and who they prefer to work with, what kinds of companies. And they said, we like ones that give us lots of room and prepared to go with the creative, opening the creative envelope. And so certainly, surprisingly, we find that often the client gets excited by new discoveries and they're willing to go in new directions often. So it is more than just a financial arrangement very often. And yes, so this project about Jotello, yes, didn't start about Jotello at all. They had quite a slightly different idea in mind, and we were very worried, actually, that we wouldn't be able to fulfill what the task, the brief that they gave us. And in casting around for a way to do it, we hit upon the whole Sauger family, and particularly Jotello. And then they really liked that and they supported that direction that we were going in. Okay, so the other questions. Majuta asked a question about why Jotello might have faced archival erasure. Yes, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how well people knew of him even at the time that he lived. That would be something to explore. I know that when Katie first said to me, do you know that one of the Sauger children was actually a vet? I thought, well, that's not very interesting. It was only much later that I discovered what an extraordinary thing it was. And, you know, especially in this time in the late 19th century when livestock health was really central to the economy. And then Medusa's, where he says, would you say his story helps to decolonize the scientific field in the 1800s? That's a fantastic question. And my answer is yes, but I want to really think about much more. That's what we're trying to work towards, is how do you use the story to help decolonize the scientific field in the 1800s? And yes, so I suppose Katie and I would both say that we do think that we've been allowed to do meaningful projects, and makes us very excited for all the hardships and stresses of doing freelance work. It can be very exciting and creative. And then just the rest, of course, ask the very hard question of what is a historian? Well, I think we change our minds about that all the time, but just some things, you know, so client often wants you to use inflated language, you know, kind of very about people, especially, you know, not to mention dubious aspects like they hit the bottle, as I said, but to present them as heroic and to write in very florid prose, you know, because they don't trust people to understand that they should be elevated by whatever kind of model you're presenting. And you have to always think about that, you know, what is your responsibility as a historian? No, we often can't accept that because it's not precise, it's kind of manipulative. And we have to say, no, we're not going to write it like that. And we don't think that you should either. You know, and often, so just to take an example from the same client that we're doing the Jotello story for, is they wanted to take another person and they really wanted to emphasize how Zulu he was. You know, they wanted to have lots of spears and kind of references to Zulu warriordom. And we were desperately trying to change that stereotype about Zulu people. And so we try to explain to them why, but you know, it was so effective and flashy, and they could have all these chants and songs and spears. So it was actually, that was very hard. We had to think about, you know, kind of enhancing those kinds of ideas of tribal affiliations and romanticizing the Zulu kingdom and so on are very problematic for us as historians. And so we tried to contest it with them, and we'll have to see how successful we are.
Yeah, because we're not privy to the final, you know, the final product in that particular project.
Okay, thank you for that. I see one more hand. It's from Karen Harris. You can go ahead.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Nathan. Thanks to both Cynthia and Katie. That was fascinating. Just carrying on from what you were saying earlier, Cynthia, I was just wondering how much of your work actually goes into the tourism domain. I remember Jeff Guy making a very snide comment at one of the and he actually published where he sort of said, you know, the tourism gloss. Are you finding getting clientele out there? And then just on another leg, we find that, you know, with our proximity at the university to the National Archives, or should I say what's left of it, we often get inquiries from overseas for people to do research. And, you know, they obviously want students to go in and do research and stuff like that. Are you finding that there's a greater tendency with that, you know, with the work that you're doing, that you are getting clients from, you know, across the globe, not wanting to come here themselves and then making use of your services? Thanks.
I think Katie will want to answer the tourism one, but I'll just say on the, yes, I know Guy's work. I've just quoted from it myself about tourism and you know, it connects with that kind of romanticization of the Zulu and the Zulu warriors and the Hail Fellow Well Met pub lunches that Guy talks about, where people relive the Zulu wars.
Yeah.
The Anglo-Zulu War. Yes, and in the beginning of our written paper, I tried to tackle that stuff, you know, about the division between heritage and history. And the unfortunate impression left by David Lowenthal's work, you know, that heritage is commercialized, partisan, not really serious, not really history. And, you know, to argue that actually there's a lot of history in the heritage field that is really well researched. And what's interesting is, as we said, that client actually really wants you to go to the archive nowadays, the clients we've worked with, because they want to be able to say, look, this comes from the archive. You know, in case they're really, really scared all the time, they will ask, but what happens if this gets onto social media? And so they actually look to the archive as kind of protective barrier. So that's a very interesting development. And Katie, maybe you can say something about the tourism and international, well, really about international people and their.
Well, we actually haven't had any international clients. I'm just trying to think back over the years. So I've been freelancing since 2012, and I think in that time I've sort of had requests like, can you go to the archive and photograph, but not, or can you pull documents for, I've done quite a lot of work for an Australian company on interstates. So, but there it's not analysis, so it's not a deep research project as such. It's more, can you go and retrieve and photograph, and they will then use the material in a court case. But we haven't actually had, I haven't actually worked with an international organization on anything, you know, at all. So there hasn't really, I haven't found that tendency at the moment. Currently, we usually pitch for projects that are this via a tendering process. So on the one hand, we'll actively try and secure work. So we'll respond to a brief, and that can be quite competitive. And so that's how we secure work in some cases. Or we get approached by external people to work on a particular project. So it's kind of a combination, but we actually haven't had any international clients yet.
But maybe you could say a couple of words about how clients just think that, you know, they can just get stuff from the archive, and you have to explain to them about protocols and costs and so on, copyright.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's quite time consuming. So one of the briefs for our projects was to secure one photograph, one photograph, one article, one document per person. And we had to explain that it doesn't kind of work like that. And to secure copyright is a process. There's also a cost attached to it, which they were very surprised at. And in some cases, we had to secure documents from a repository in London, and the cost was, I mean, it was quite expensive, but the client then didn't actually want to pay for those costs because they didn't understand why would you have to pay for the services of an archive. They also got terribly frustrated at the turnaround time that it takes to get a digitized document to use, say, for example, at an exhibition. So there were those kinds of things that have to be negotiated with clients kind of from the start. I'm not sure if that covers.
Okay, thanks. I see one more hand, and then after this, maybe you can just give your closing remarks. Edwin, you can go ahead.
Thank you. I promise this is the last one. I'm toying with the notion of the concept of the ghost of the archive and how you utilize it in this exercise, because I get lost between who is doing the ghosting. Is Jotello, the absence of Jotello Festiri's life in the archive, ghosting us? Or are we who's doing the ghosting? Who's haunting who here? And how does it work in this context? I've also been, and I ask this because I've been toying with the notion of hidden histories, which seems to be, for me, a better palatable concept of bringing to the fore histories that have been overlooked, or not raised before, or not given any due attention. and sort of avoiding the contestations that come out and all sorts of negative repercussions to using loaded concepts. That's the one point that I have. The other point that I have is about the client and commissioned work. I'm working on a project on the history of Somafco from the inside, and there is a survey history published by Sean Morrow, Brown Maba, and Louisa Pulumani from Fort Hare, using the archives at the University of Fort Hare in the Liberation Movement's archives. And that history was a commissioned history. And so the question becomes, in relation to what you are positing here, is does the fact that it's a commissioned exercise have influence or determine the quality of the work, or the validity or the veracity of the work that is produced versus a non-commissioned one? Does doing work as a professional historian for a client make you a professional prostitute or an authentic historian? What are the implications of the language we use in these spaces? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Edwin. You can respond to that, Cynthia and Katie, and then maybe you can give your closing remarks, and then we can close off today's seminar.
Well, I'll combine my response to Edwin with my closing remarks, if that's okay. So yeah, I think the idea of hidden histories, that's very much part of Katie and my kind of heritage from the history workshop. You know, that's what we started off with. You know, when I started long ago being a historian, that was what was in vogue. And yes, I suppose we've retained our interest and our commitment to finding people and episodes that have been hidden and bringing them to light. I suppose because, as Kate explained, one of our central texts has Vern Harris's book, which was published in 2020, I think, which is about the ghosts of the archive. And that in turn comes from Jacques Derrida, you know, and I've become, let's see, Vern Harris really likes Derrida's work very much. And I've become much more open to it because his idea of ghosts is very evocative. And so there's the idea that you can't get away from them. They might be absent from the archive. You might have to look really hard to find them in the archive, but they're there all the same. And in a way, they're irresistible. You become haunted by them. And Derrida's ghosts are very tricky. I think they're probably trickier than Vern's ghosts. They can actually penetrate your subconscious. They actually can start speaking for you without you realizing what they're doing. So that for me is a really powerful image of being haunted by the ghosts. And it's not different from hidden histories. It's just another way of seeing it that appeals to me. And then Vern Harris, I like the way that he picks up this very contemporary term, you know, that the kids use really, about how so-and-so ghosted me. I just didn't hear from him. He cut me off his social media platform, and that was it, and I don't know why. And I thought, well, that's interesting. There are lots of ways that I want to think about these subjects that we've discovered who aren't well known. You know, I think some of them would be marooned, to use another idea that comes from Carolyn Hamilton. Some of them are maligned, like one of our subjects has ended up with a dreadful reputation. And at first clients said, no, there's no way we can do this person. He was just awful. And then Katie and I did a whole lot of research, and we discovered that actually it's just been maligned by critics and historians who haven't done their homework. And there's no, look, he might be as bad as he was supposed to have been, but there's no real evidence that he was. So just to get at all those different ways in which subjects have suffered at the hands of historians often, and other kinds of writers. And so, yeah, the idea of ghosting, the idea that people are just dropped and they don't know why. It's a kind of conceit, but it appealed to me. And so that's why I tried to work it into the paper. And I didn't want to go on at length about Derrida, but yes, I think it all goes back to him and his very famous concept of ontology, which is supposed to be a play on ontology. It works better in French. Thanks.
I mean, I think the ghosting part is also was a question that came from client on the one hand as to why the people that are grouped in that particular project have been sidelined, why they're not in, why the public isn't aware of their achievements, why it is that very few people know that Jotello was the very first vet, regardless of racial classification. We did spend quite a lot of time discussing with client why that is so. Yeah, I think that particular project has been, you know, incredibly inspiring to work on, incredibly humbling. At the same time, encountering the archive, there were some very, very special moments, not expecting to find much, and then suddenly seeing this, you know, the first vet's signature on a document, for example. It was just quite amazing, because at the start we hadn't thought it, we didn't actually think we'd be able to fulfill the terms of the brief. So there was quite a lot of negotiation. I think one of the challenges of commissioned work is that you do have to do a fair amount of negotiation. It isn't always as you know, it's not, it depends on the individual historian taking the project. But Cynthia and I tend, you know, we feel a huge responsibility of making sure that things are right, or presenting as an accurate as one can get view of the past. So none of our projects are, they always end up being deep, and so we never actually stick to, we actually never really stick to the timing attached to a brief, because we kind of go overboard, or maybe that's just me who goes overboard. But there's a certain amount of responsibility in taking on, especially projects that are public histories, that you know, that are going to go online. You know, even producing, you know, timelines or exhibition work. It's actually it's quite nerve-wracking in a way, because you do have to make sure that there's accurate representation. So I'm babbling now. I think that's it for me.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Cynthia Kros and Katie Mooney, for your very interesting presentation. And thank you for everybody who participated in our discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you
very much. And thanks to everyone for coming. It was really great and thought-provoking. Thank you.
Thanks.